President Harry S. Truman signed the National Security Act in 1947, creating the Central Intelligence Agency. Problems with oversight and unmonitored CIA activities began 2 years later when Congress passed the Central Intelligence Agency Act. The act provided that CIA funds could be included in the budgets of other departments and then transferred to the agency without restriction to the initial appropriation. Basically, secret funding that very few could trace. As you may expect, some senators and congressmen were not in favor, warning that the CIA would set up a military Gestapo within the United States. Congressional fears grew when the CIA created a covert action wing called the Office of Policy Coordination, led by Wall Street lawyer Frank Wisner. And it didn't take long for the fears to become reality. Later in 1949, Wisner established Mockingbird, a program to influence foreign media. Philip Graham from the Washington Post was recruited to run the program within the industry. And soon, many of America's leading newspapers and magazines were being influenced.
This would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
Project Mockingbird really accelerated when Dwight D. Eisenhower was elected president in 1952. Eisenhower's vice president was Richard Nixon, who had become known for his work in trying to prove that American government official Alger Hiss was a communist. Nixon echoed Senator Joseph McCarthy's assertions that communists were infiltrating every aspect of American life. Also coming into power with Eisenhower was Secretary of State John Foster Dulles, and shortly after, Dulles' brother Allen, who became the first civilian CIA director. Both were Eastern establishment lawyers who had questionable dealings with Nazi officials before and after World War II, and had been accused by some with money laundering for their corporate clients. Allen Dulles personally took over and accelerated the Mockingbird project, placing CIA reports with both knowing and unknowing reporters, then watching those reports be cited and repeated throughout the media wire services. In the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were engaged in propaganda efforts.
And then they realized, the easy way to get people, to protect American business investments was to control foreign governments. And in Iran in 1953, the British had come and asked for help because Iran was making noises about nationalizing its oil that Britain was especially dependent on. U.S. was not, but Britain was. And so we worked with them to overthrow Mossadegh in Iran and install the Shah, who became a much hated figure, and the Ayatollah and the fundamentalism that we see in Iran today is a direct reaction to the Shah, who we put in, who is essentially a fascist, who ran the country like a dictator.
Flush with success with the Iran overthrow, the CIA almost immediately decided to overthrow President Jacobo Arbenz Guzman of Guatemala. The United Fruit Company, in which both Dulles brothers were major stockholders, owned hundreds of thousands of acres of land in Guatemala, along with the railroad system, the telegraph system, and controlled nearly all of the country's trade. President Arbenz tried to diversify the country's agriculture and also to provide land to poor peasants. The Dulles brothers led the opposition, staging an overthrow of the Arbenz government under the guise of fighting communist expansion. Ultimately, President Eisenhower became concerned that CIA covert activities were being poorly coordinated with American foreign policy, and might even be working primarily for senior corporate interests centered on upper-class families of the Northeastern establishment. Eisenhower appointed David Bruce to investigate the agency. The report was very critical of the agency's interference into the operations of democratically elected governments. Further, the report was exceedingly critical of Operation Mockingbird. So now one of the questions that many people have about the Kennedy assassination begins to be answered. How could the facts of the murder be covered up so quickly and thoroughly? Well, the same way the American public was never told the truth about the CIA overthrow in Iran or Guatemala. It was simply business as usual with an American press that was under the direct influence of an unregulated intelligence agency with its own policy-making desires. Want a perfect example? Think about the famous Zapruder film, the best visual record of the Kennedy assassination. Life magazine publisher Henry Luce purchased the film within 48 hours of the Kennedy murder, not to show it to the public, but to lock it away for as long as possible. Why? Still not quite convinced? Well, let's look at some of the other actions of our unregulated CIA under Director Allen Dulles in the 1950s. The agency began extensive research into mind control with its MK-Ultra program, using US and Canadian test subjects, usually without their knowledge or permission. MK-Ultra tried to manipulate mental states and alter brain functions through the administration of drugs and other chemicals, hypnosis, sensory deprivation, and verbal and sexual abuse. Many experiments used the drug LSD. In one series of experiments, subjects were administered LSD for 77 consecutive days. At least one death is attributed to MK-Ultra, but many more are suspected. CIA Director Richard Helms purposefully and illegally destroyed MK-Ultra files in 1973 when ordered to appear before a congressional committee. If all of this wasn't enough, the CIA got Eisenhower's permission to set up an undercover organization called Operation 40 in 1959. The infamous group included Frank Sturgis, who would become a Watergate burglar, Felix Rodriguez, a CIA operative who would murder revolutionary Che Guevara in cold blood, Luis Posada, convicted in Venezuela of blowing up a Cuban passenger airliner, and Orlando Bosch, convicted of political murder in Chile. Operating with little or no oversight, Operation 40 exploded a ship under a Belgian flag in Havana Bay, killing or injuring 275 people, mostly civilians. Over the next few years, Operation 40 would work closely with several anti-Castro Cuban organizations, including Alpha 66, the most violent of the Eisenhower-approved Cuban military groups that trained in the Everglades. Alpha 66 was a group directed by David Atlee Phillips, chief of covert action at the CIA's Mexico City station, and as we will soon see, a key CIA player in planning the assassination of President John Kennedy. In early 1962, David Phillips was so out of control that he deployed Alpha 66 in attacks on Russian ships in Cuban ports. The purpose of the provocative raids was to draw JFK into a war with Cuba. Later in 1962, Win Scott, another CIA operative, will actually send raiding parties into Cuba during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again trying to force JFK into military conflict. So from 1953 on, we've got a CIA who controls what Americans will read through their Operation Mockingbird, a CIA who is setting their own policy of assassinations and overthrowing democratically elected governments for their own members' monetary and ideologic purposes, a CIA conducting drug and mind control experiments on American citizens without their consent. It just can't get any worse than this. Can it?
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it.
In September 1960, CIA Director Allen Dulles and his Director of Operations Richard Bissell initiated talks with two leading figures of the Mafia, Johnny Rosselli and Sam Giancana, to assassinate Cuban President Fidel Castro. The plan was authorized by President Eisenhower. Later, other crime bosses such as Carlos Marcello, Santo Trafficante, and Meyer Lansky became involved in the plot. The CIA offered the Mafia $150,000 to kill Fidel Castro. The advantage of employing the Mafia for this work is that it provided the CIA with a credible cover story. The Mafia were known to be angry with Castro for closing down their profitable brothels and casinos in Cuba. If the assassins were killed or captured, the media would accept that the Mafia were working on their own. We now know that the Mafia played along in order to get protection from the FBI. At least 9 plots were hatched by the CIA for Castro's assassination, but they all failed. There is every indication that President Eisenhower greatly feared the CIA corporate behemoth that he had allowed to get so out of control during his presidency, although he had done nearly nothing to rein it in. The outgoing president devoted much of his parting speech to warning America of the dangers of the military-industrial complex.
In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
And so it is in this atmosphere that President John F. Kennedy is inaugurated in January 1961. Kennedy leaves no doubt that he rejects the certitude of war with the Soviet Union that the military and CIA is so convinced of.
Let both sides seek to invoke the wonders of science instead of its terrors. Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depth, and encourage the arts and commerce. Let both sides unite to heed in all corners of the earth the command of Isaiah to undo the heavy burdens and let the oppressed go free. And if a beachhead of cooperation may push back the jungle of suspicion, let both sides join in creating a new endeavor, not a new balance of power, but a new world of law, where the strong are just and the weak secure, and the peace preserved.
But before he can begin to execute his own administration's plans for moving forward, he is confronted by the last vestige of the Eisenhower presidency, a plan for exiled Cuban refugees to invade the island, hatched under Vice President Richard Nixon and CIA Director Allen Dulles.
So when Kennedy comes into office, with Cuba, he had already been essentially confronted with this Bay of Pigs operation, which had been set up during the Eisenhower administration. He had all kinds of questions about it, which Allen Dulles was very reluctant to answer. Well, the Bay of Pigs turned out to be a disaster. You know, it was, and in fact, the most recent scholarship on the Bay of Pigs says it was never really meant to succeed. And what was really meant to do was for it to fail, and then Kennedy would have to, under the pressure of defeat, he would then have to call in the Navy, which just happened to be in the area at that time, to save the day. Well, Kennedy didn't do that. And much to everybody's shock and surprise, he went ahead and accepted the defeat, right? And so, but after this, he did an investigation of the whole Bay of Pigs operation. And he came to the conclusion that he was snookered, and therefore he then fired the whole top level of the Central Intelligence Agency. This was Allen Dulles, this was Dick Bissell, who was the director of plans, and Lieutenant Director Charles Cabell.
In the 3 years he was in office, John F. Kennedy became one of the most respected and popular presidents in U.S. history. JFK reduced the tensions of the Cold War, while at the same time solidified the U.S. strategic position against the Soviets. He called on the American people to come together as a community and serve the country as a whole. He started the Peace Corps. He began a space program that led to a manned moon mission later in the decade. He worked hard to end segregation, and he prohibited discrimination in the sale or lease of housing. Kennedy successfully fought the powerful Texas oil millionaires and their representatives in Congress. He stood up and bested steel company executives when they reneged on an agreement not to inflate prices recklessly. Americans and people around the world saw his desire to stop poor people from being manipulated by powerful interests was genuine. Mostly people trusted him to champion their desire for simple fairness. Kennedy took the initiative and began a back-channel series of letter writing with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The letters led to each man understanding and respecting the other, and both men realized they were each surrounded by military advisors that understood only war. It was this personal relationship between JFK and Premier Khrushchev that quite possibly saved the world from nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962. The Soviets had secretly begun to build bases and deploy nuclear weapons in Cuba as a response to U.S. bases and nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy. For 13 days, military advisors on both sides pushed for confrontation, but Kennedy and Khrushchev worked out a solution that satisfied both countries and averted a nuclear catastrophe. The world credited the leaders for working out a logical, sane solution to one of the most dangerous times in world history. But military code warriors like American General Curtis LeMay accused Kennedy of cowardness, preferring a military confrontation, which he felt was inevitable.
And Kennedy learned a very, very difficult lesson during the whole Bay of Pigs thing, in that he learned that not to trust his advisors, that a lot of his advisors didn't have the same kind of interest that he did. So then during the Cuban Missile Crisis, again, he does not accept their advice, because almost everybody wanted him to either invade the island or launch airstrikes against the missile silos. Well, he did neither, and in fact, he went for the least provocative solution, which was the blockade, and at the same time, he had a back channel, through his brother to the Russians, and that's the way the dispute was settled.
On November 21st, 1963, a year after the Cuban Missile Crisis, with his popularity at an all-time high, the President and First Lady left for their 2-day Texas trip. They arrived in San Antonio, where they were greeted by a large and enthusiastic crowd. The presidential party then motorcaded to Brooks Air Force Base, where the President made a speech.
To the fact that we do stand on the edge of a great new era, filled with both crisis and opportunity.
Then it was on to Houston, where JFK attended a testimonial dinner at Rice University Stadium honoring Congressman Albert Thomas.
Growth has meant new opportunities for this state. Progress has meant new achievements. And we dare not look back now.
And finally, on to Fort Worth, where the President and Mrs. Kennedy spend the night. President Kennedy started his final day in great spirits at a Chamber of Commerce breakfast meeting at the Texas Hotel in Fort Worth.
2 years ago, I said that, introduced myself in Paris by saying that I was the man who had accompanied Mrs. Kennedy to Paris. I'm getting that same sensation as I travel around Texas.
Just like the rest of the Texas cities JFK would visit, the crowds in Fort Worth were extremely enthusiastic. From Fort Worth, it was a short plane ride from Carswell Air Force Base to Dallas's Love Field. Plans called for the President and Mrs. Kennedy to motorcade to the Dallas Trade Mart, where JFK was scheduled to make a luncheon speech.
With some of the hundreds of people who have come here to view their arrival. And now, the President and First Lady are retreating from the fence. They're heading now for the official limousine where Governor Connolly stands, waiting their arrival so that they can make their way downtown and out to the Trade Mart.
As the presidential motorcade left Love Field, the president was unaware of certain events in and around Dallas that had taken place over the past several months regarding the man who would soon be accused of killing him. In the 2 months preceding JFK's trip to Dallas, Lee Oswald, or someone impersonating him, had been spotted at least 10 times in the area. Each time he made sure his behavior was exaggerated and conspicuous so that people would remember him. In the last week of September, 2 Latin men calling themselves Leopoldo and Angel visited 26-year-old Cuban immigrant Sylvia Odio, claiming to know her father. Leopoldo and Angel introduced a man with them as Leon Oswald, an American interested in their cause. 2 days later, Leopoldo called Odio and asked her opinion of Oswald. Leopoldo told Odio that the American had called Cubans cowards for not killing JFK after the Bay of Pigs defeat, and that Oswald said Kennedy could be killed and that he was an ex-Marine and expert shot. Odio identified the Oswald at her door to the FBI as the man arrested after JFK's assassination. On November 1, 1963, the same time the Chicago plot was unraveling, Oswald, or more likely an imposter, was making a scene at Morgan's gun shop in Fort Worth. According to witness Dewey Bradford, the man was loud, rude, and impertinent, and made a point of telling him that he had been in the Marine Corps. In mid-afternoon the next day, November 2nd, a young man walked into the Lincoln Mercury dealership near Dealey Plaza in Dallas. He told salesman Albert Bogard he was interested in a Mercury Comet and would pay for the car in cash in a couple of weeks. The man claiming to be Oswald then took Bogard for a wild, erratic test drive on Stemmons Freeway. Upon returning, he acted angry at Bogard and fellow salesman Eugene Wilson when told he would need credit to buy the car. He said maybe he would have to go back to Russia to buy a car. At the Sportsdrome shooting range in Dallas on November 10th, Malcolm Price will identify Lee Harvey Oswald as the man who asked him to sight his rifle scope for him and then fired 3 consecutive bullseyes at a very difficult target with nearly no daylight left. 1 week later, on November 17th, Garland Slack finished putting up his target when a man turned his rifle on it, emptying his magazine. When Slack objected strenuously, the man who he said was Lee Harvey Oswald to the Warren Commission gave him a look that he said he would never forget. Oswald, or someone impersonating him, was making it easy to remember him in situations that would suggest he was training for a killing. The Warren Commission would ignore the gun shop sighting by Dewey Bradford totally. Likewise, the Warren Commission would dismiss the FBI reports from Alfred Bogard and Eugene Wilson at the Lincoln Mercury dealership, claiming that Oswald could not drive, and that they felt apparently Oswald was elsewhere that day. As for the Malcolm Price and Garland Slack Sportsdrome shooting range sightings, the Warren Commission would say that both men must have been mistaken. In all 3 cases, as well as the uninvited visit to Sylvia Odio, the Warren Commission will leave uninvestigated the obvious explanation that Lee Oswald had been impersonated in all cases. We now know that Leopoldo was almost certainly Bernardo de Torres, a Bay of Pigs participant and CIA contract employee. In just a few years, de Torres will be one of at least 9 CIA agents who will infiltrate and attempt to destroy New Orleans District Attorney Jim Garrison's own investigation into the JFK assassination. During the Garrison investigation, de Torres will be implicated in the deaths of 2 key witnesses, David Ferry and Eladio Del Valle. They will die within 12 hours of each other. Ferry murdered in New Orleans and Del Valle murdered in Miami. Further, in an almost impossible-to-believe scenario, de Torres will be called by the House Select Committee on Assassinations in 1976, but be given immunity by the CIA, and the investigators were not allowed to ask him anything about the time leading up to Kennedy's assassination. De Torres will then become a partner of legendary CIA arms manufacturer Mitch Rorbel, and act as an arms dealer and CIA contract killer in Latin America. De Torres almost certainly was involved in the planning and assassination of President John Kennedy in Dallas. As of this report, he is 78 years old and living in retirement in Florida. Further, Sylvia Odio's father was a member of JOR, a Cuban exile group favored by the Kennedys to take over in the case of Castro's overthrow, but greatly disliked by the CIA. The agency seemed to be trying to implicate Oswald and JOR in the JFK assassination with the objective of eliminating both. Surprised? We're in Chicago, not Dallas.
What many people do not know, even those who are familiar with most of the facts of the JFK case, is that there were two plots to kill President Kennedy in November of 1963. The first one was 3 weeks earlier in Chicago. Kennedy was supposed to arrive at O'Hare Airport on Saturday, November 2nd at 11:40 a.m. He was to attend the Army Air Force football game at Soldier Field. But on Wednesday, October 30th, the FBI told the Secret Service in Chicago that a plot was afoot to kill Kennedy there.
There were actually two tips that reached the Secret Service in the week before JFK's trip here to Chicago, and we'll soon see that the two were interrelated. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover reported the first tip. Hoover's information was that at least one hit team with high-powered rifles would attempt to shoot the president from a warehouse or office building overlooking the president's motorcade route that coming Saturday. An FBI informant named Lee provided the information. And yes, the Lee providing the tip and probably saving JFK's life that weekend may well have been Lee Harvey Oswald. A break in the case came on Thursday, October 31st, 2 days before the president's arrival at O'Hare. A landlady at a rooming house here in the vicinity of Clark and Division Streets reported that she oversaw 4 rifles with scopes and a map of the president's motorcade route in one of the rooms she had rented to 4 dark-complected men. Chicago's Secret Service initiated 24-hour surveillance, but an agent named J. Lloyd Stocks blew his cover in an alley behind the rooming house the following evening on Friday and had to take 2 of the men into immediate custody. Stocks questioned one of the suspects all night, while fellow Secret Service agent Robert Motto separately questioned the other man. By morning, neither agent had gotten his man to reveal anything, and Kennedy's plane was due at O'Hare in just a couple of hours. The second tip involved a man reported spouting anti-Kennedy rhetoric and known to have owned multiple firearms. There were some amazing similarities between this man and the man who would be arrested for JFK's murder 3 weeks later.
The planned patsy in Chicago was to be played by a man with a similar profile as Lee Harvey Oswald. His name was Thomas Valet. The Secret Service was tailing him also, since the word was out that he had made violent threats against Kennedy. Consider the parallels between Oswald and Valet. Like Oswald, Valet was a former Marine who was stationed at a U-2 base in Japan. Like Oswald, the cover unit for Valet's probable CIA recruitment was something called Joint Technical Advisory Group. Valet had spoken bitterly of JFK and Cuba. He said, "We lost a lot of good men at the Bay of Pigs." Valet had both rifles and ammunition in his apartment, since he had trained anti-Castro Cubans in Long Island, so the police trailed him. They pulled him over just a couple of hours before Kennedy was to arrive at O'Hare. It turned out that, like Oswald in Dallas, Valet had a job in a warehouse along the president's motorcade route.
Today, condominiums, 625 West Jackson Street, was a warehouse in 1963. Thomas Valet had been given a job at the IPP Lithoplate Company, a printer on the 3rd floor. Kennedy's limousine was scheduled to make a slow turn from the Northwest Expressway onto the Jackson Street exit and go right by Valet's 3rd floor window. So in August 1963, just as Lee Oswald was preparing to move from New Orleans back to Dallas, Thomas Vallée moved from New York City back to Chicago. Just as Oswald got a job right over Kennedy's future motorcade route in Dallas, so too did Vallée get a job in a warehouse right over Kennedy's future motorcade route in Chicago.
So the setup with a disaffected Marine patsy in a warehouse on an elevated floor above a presidential motorcade traveling at a slow pace below, with snipers hidden about the scene with telescopic rifles, and the patsy having gun and ammo in his possession, this is all almost eerily similar to what's going to happen in Dallas.
But it gets even more interesting. Just about the exact time JFK is scheduled to visit Chicago, half a world away in Vietnam, South Vietnamese President Diem and his brother are murdered in a CIA-sponsored plot. False CIA cables sent from Washington seemingly give Kennedy's okay for the assassination, even though he has ordered the CIA multiple times not to proceed in their request to kill Diem. Here is famed CIA agent E. Howard Hunt later testifying before a congressional committee about the false cables.
Just that I might be able to improve upon the record.
And what did you understand him to mean when he said to improve upon the record?
To fabricate cables that could substitute for the missing chronological cables.
Did you in fact fabricate cables for the purpose of indicating the relationship of the Kennedy administration and the assassination of Diem?
I did.
And did you show these fabricated cables to Mr. Colson?
I did.
We'll discuss Vietnam more a bit later, but it's important to know that President Kennedy had recently signed National Security Action Memo 263, calling for the almost immediate withdrawal of 1,000 advisors from Vietnam by the end of 1963, and the withdrawal of all American military personnel by the end of 1965. He was so angry after hearing about the murder of the Diem brothers that he recalled Ambassador Henry Cabot Lodge that Saturday morning with the intent of firing him upon his return from his Texas trip. He had also ordered his Defense Secretary Robert McNamara to speed up preparations for the withdrawal of American military advisors from Vietnam. Similar to Laos the year before, Kennedy had made the decision that the United States would not get bogged down in an unwinnable war in the jungles of Southeast Asia. And once again, the military and industrial hierarchies that JFK had inherited from the Eisenhower administration were advising just the opposite. President Kennedy's National Security Action Memo 263, ordering all military personnel home from Vietnam by the end of 1965, was reversed by Lyndon Johnson with input from members of the military-industrial complex just 4 days after the murder of JFK in the streets of Dallas, assuring the Vietnam War. Back in Chicago that Saturday morning, November 2, 1963, crowds had started to line the streets in preparation for President Kennedy's visit. The press plane had taken off from Washington, but at least 2 shooters remained at large, and Kennedy's advisors convinced him to cancel his trip. And finally, the arrest of Thomas Arthur Vallée is made. Vallée's arrest was made by 2 CIA-connected Chicago police officers, that is, officers who either worked nearly exclusively for the CIA or took extensive CIA training away from their normal jobs. Officers Daniel Groth and Peter Sherla had watched Vallée all night, but only arrested him at 9:10 a.m., 2.5 hours before the president was due in Chicago and after the trip was officially canceled. The impression given is that the purpose of the 2 intelligence-connected officers may not have been to restrain Vallée, but instead to shadow him until after the president had been shot. For the success of the assassination plot, the scapegoat had to remain free, so long as Kennedy was still coming to Chicago and could be killed there. If the officer's purpose was, as claimed, to get Vallée off the street and protect the president, well then why was Vallée's arrest put off until after government authorities knew President Kennedy was no longer coming to Chicago? On the following Monday and Tuesday, Special Agent in Charge Maurice Martineau collected the Chicago plot information from his Secret Service agents. Unlike their work in other investigations, they were told to prepare no documents of their own. Following Martineau's orders, the Chicago agents dictated oral reports to the office's secretary. They were then ordered to turn in their notebooks. Secret Service Washington Chief James J. Rowley had phoned Martineau from Washington asking that the Chicago office use a special COS, or Central Office Secret File Number, for this case. In the Chicago office, only Martineau wrote and saw the top secret report. He then sent it by special courier to Washington Chief James Rowley. Incredibly, Secret Service agents in Dallas and the Dallas police will never be told about the activities in Chicago. They will not be told that a 4-man hit team was sent to Chicago less than 3 weeks before with the intent of shooting the president with high-powered rifles from unguarded office buildings overlooking his motorcade route. Records of the 2 detained men questioned by Secret Service agents Stocks and Motto all night before the president's scheduled arrival the next morning will disappear. A few days after the Dallas assassination, NBC News in Chicago learned about Vallee's arrest. They found that Vallee's license plate information came back as frozen. Only the FBI could obtain this information. Also, the registration plate on the car Thomas Arthur Vallee was driving at the time of his arrest was classified, restricted to U.S. intelligence agencies, and NBC News got no further. Why did James Rowley, head of the Secret Service in Washington, not make sure everyone in Dallas 3 weeks later was informed about the Chicago plot, and especially about securing the motorcade route? We'll see shortly that just the opposite happened. Not only was the Chicago plot not used as a reason to escalate security around President Kennedy, some Dallas police officers were actually ordered to stand down, not to assist in the protection of the president in their own city, and routine assistance from military personnel from bases in the area to assist in the protection of the president was most uncharacteristically refused. Again by the Secret Service in Washington, and specifically by Secret Service Washington Chief James Rowley. Further, when Chicago Secret Service agent Abraham Bolden tried to contact the Warren Commission several months later with information about the Chicago plot, he was arrested on false charges. Bolden was placed in jail, keeping him from telling what he knew about the Chicago plot to the public and the Warren Commission. Not one word about the Chicago plot appears in the Warren Commission report.